Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the final session of the Road to Reconnect. We have some amazing guests here with us today, but before we get started, I would just like to introduce you guys to the Reconnect conference. Inshallah, this conference will be happening soon. I have the registration link down below, so it's reconnect2020.eventbrite.com. For this conference, we have a lot of exciting speakers joining us. We are currently in our final session, so next week the conference will begin. There are multiple artists, entertainment, speakers from all around the country, some international artists as well, inshallah. So it'll be a fun family event for the whole family. It'll be happening on October 9th from 7:30 to 10:30 p.m. as well as October 10th from 7:30 to 10 p.m. inshallah. All right, so let's introduce our speakers. We have Sister Amal Kassir as our host for the evening. She has performed in 10 countries and over 100 cities, from youth prisons to orphanages to refugee camps. Her work in the community involves humanitarian initiatives for Syria, speaking out and organizing against Islamophobia, and empowering the voice of the marginalized through writing and speaking. Our two panelists are Sister Dalia Fahmy and Sister Dalia Mogahed. Sister Dalia Fahmy is an associate professor of political science at Long Island University. She has published several articles in academic journals focusing on the effects of Islamophobia on U.S. foreign policy. Sister Dalia Mogahed is a director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research through leadership programs on American Muslims. She is a former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she leads the analysis of surveys of Muslim communities worldwide. So inshallah, I'm very proud to introduce to you our three guests for the evening.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. It truly is a delight to be here. And I think the topic that we have today, it could not have come at a better time. My name is Amal, and usually I'm a poet, but today I come very simply as a member of the Muslim community, specifically as a youth. And I have been privileged with the opportunity to sit with two women who I have always seen as heroes. And in an attempt to search for this reconnection, to put our feet back on a path and move towards the greater purpose as Muslims in America, I think the questions that we're going to talk about tonight are going to answer a lot of questions that me and my cohort have been asking. So I think the best way to get started is a little bit of an icebreaker, and to just ask both of our Dalias today, what are some of the hats, or I guess hijabs, that you are currently wearing on your day-to-day? What kind of events are you involved in and roles are you taking? I guess we can start with Dr. Dalia Fahmy.
So first, Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you to all of you at the Reconnect conference for inviting me and giving me a platform with someone who I very much admire, Dalia Mogahed. So it's an honor to be with all of you. In terms of hats and hijabs, primarily I'm a professor of political science. I'm also a fellow at a think tank in Washington that looks at foreign policy. But, you know, aside from sitting on boards and all of that, none of that is as important to me as being a mother. So I'm a mother of 2 children. And so I know usually people like to focus on the fancy stuff, the degrees, the boards, but the most important role I have is the mother of 2 kids.
That's great, thank you. And Sister Dalia Mogahed.
Assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's really an honor to be here. I've been looking forward to hanging out with you guys on Saturday night all day. So it's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. My day job is as the director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And in addition to that, I do a lot of public speaking. It used to be around the country. Now it's via Zoom from my dining room. So that's been a big change, but honestly a welcomed one. I'm also the mother of 2 boys, 2 men now almost. 20 and a 14-year-old. And that's a big, just like Dalia said, a big part of my identity is as a mom. In addition to that, I really see myself as a seeker. I am a lifelong student of the Quran and of the Islamic sciences. By no means anything other than a student, but it's something I'm very passionate about.
That's wonderful. May Allah all your children and amplify all of the work that you do. I want to know a little bit about how you ended up where you are today. Sort of the background, educational upbringing that led you to doing the work that you're both doing. I guess we can go in the same order. Dr. Dalia?
So I'm very fortunate. I come from a family of very passionate scholars and activists. My parents immigrated to the United States in the 60s. And although they came to this new place, they came as professionals and very quickly sought to establish for themselves and the very, very few that they found in the street, a kind of community. And so since I would say the early 70s, my parents have been involved in, really out of need, establishing mosques, Islamic schools, that kind of stuff. So I grew up in that environment where, not only were you expected to do very well in school, but you were also expected to be very much part of the community and giving back. So I grew up in that environment. I know I'm very fortunate that was my upbringing. But in terms of my professional career, I started college just like every brown kid, a pre-med student. I took, I think it was the first semester of my sophomore year, I took a course called Intro to International Relations. And it was one of those classes where I didn't know if I should just stop and listen to everything the professor was saying or write down everything he was saying. And so I remember going to his office and saying, this is Professor Michael Gillian. He's a big political economist. I walked into his office and I said, Professor Gillian, I think I want to be a political science major. I've never been so passionate about something I'm hearing, the way international relations works. And he sat me down and he said, look, as a child of immigrants, you have to be very careful about dropping this pre-med thing. I said, I'm not going to drop it, but I'm definitely going to be a political science major. And he was my advisor throughout college. And alhamdulillah, I did very well there. And then he, at the end told me, I was writing, at that point, there was an article that had just come out in Foreign Affairs. This is how old I am. It was called Clash of Civilizations, ? By Samuel Huntington. It came out in Foreign Affairs. And by the time, of course, it came out in book form, the question mark was removed, right? It was Clash of Civilizations. And then by the time it was in our foreign policy, it was with an exclamation mark. And so I was writing a response to this, and he said, I think you have a lot of good ideas here. You should think about going to graduate school. And so I was also blessed to have mentors that both in academia and in my personal life who never did not encourage me to pursue goals that I didn't even think were on my horizon, right? Sometimes we don't know, am I getting a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or a teacher, not knowing that there are all these other things that we can do when we're passionate about a subject. And so I was very lucky that I was passionate about a subject that I ended up not just working in and writing in, but becoming a professor of the very same course that inspired me in New York City with that same professor just at the next door university. So alhamdulillah, I've just been very fortunate.
Wow, Akbar, that's amazing. And when you broke the news that you were shifting from political science or from pre-med to political science, what was that conversation like?
Alhamdulillah, again, I'm blessed with parents who their only, I think, objective for me was to be a good Muslim in this world, to work towards the akhirah. I'll tell you, when I was in college, a really short story, my father came up to my bedroom one time. He was like, Dalia, why are you studying so hard? And I said, Bo, because when I graduate from college, I'm not just going to graduate. Like, I'm going to graduate with the highest honors. And he said to me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't care if you graduate college with honors, if it's not going to help you to graduate from this life with honors. And it was, I think, that kind of upbringing that do whatever you want to do, but make sure there's a higher purpose for it. And that was my dad. My mom was like, and make sure you're very successful and you go all the way to the end and end up making money somehow. But they were completely fine with the no pre-med, but the expectation was still that I was going to carry it out to the end.
That's great. Great. Dalia Mogahed, how about you?
Well, I started out in the other brown person major. I was an engineer. So I finished engineering. Actually, I graduated from chemical engineering at the University of Wisconsin. And while I was doing engineering, I was very passionate about, really very similar things as Dalia, except not academically, but as an activist. So I led an organization called the Bosnia Relief Committee, and this was way back during the Bosnia genocide, so that's how old I am. And we worked on, relief efforts as well as advocating for Bosnians and an end to the genocide. And I was a co-started an organization called TIME, TIME, Truth in the Middle East. I wrote about issues, relating to Muslims and Islamophobia before there was a word for it in the newspaper of my university. And so I had these sort of like parallel lives of like engineer by day and activist by night. And I graduated from that and started a corporate job as a chemical engineer, like, I was supposed to, and kind of followed the script, got married, and was just like living a normal Egyptian American life. And then 9/11 happened, and sort of everything shifted and went upside down. And I was in graduate school at the time pursuing an MBA. And really my intentions changed for that degree, from one of, simply an MBA for the sake of having an MBA to a very different kind of purpose of using that kind of a degree to better communicate what Islam really was at a time where I felt it was crucial, a critical thing to do. And so during my work, during my school, going to graduate school, I applied for the outreach director job at the university, at the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh, where I lived and went to graduate school at Pitt. And I think I was the only one that, probably I was the only one that applied. But anyway, I got this job where we had just moved to Pittsburgh, and I started doing outreach work, educating, school kids and law enforcement, whoever wanted to know about Islam and Muslims, using my marketing skills, the skills that I was learning in graduate school as an MBA student, and graduated with an MBA, having done all this work as outreach director, and then joined Gallup, again, another corporate job, nothing to do with my passion, but one that I really enjoyed. And then a year into it, the CEO of Gallup announced a new project called the World Poll, where they were going to survey the whole world. And I very bravely raised my hand and said, I think we should, we were already polling Muslim countries, but I suggested that we do a specialization in Muslim majority countries and start a Center for Muslim Studies. And we eventually got a funder for that. And so I was able to become the executive director of that center, and wrote a book with John Esposito, and the rest is history. And I got to do, first time in my life, I sort of brought my passion and my profession together. Yeah, far, far away from where I started, but that's how I came to be where I am.
Wow. And do you both feel like the purpose was very clear from the start? Or was it something that had to kind of develop over time? Dr. Dalia Fahmy, if you have this answer.
I will tell you that I wanted to do something with my life that had meaning, was always there. But again, I was even as a kid, looking for this purpose, but hopefully for the sake of Allah, like really for Allah's pleasure. And I would say, even, when I'm surgeon, inshallah, it's going to be, in this vein. And so I don't think, and sometimes we think that it's simply the activist model or the Islamic teacher scholar model that is the big purpose job, right? No, it's the reorienting. I mean, all of us go through this. Like I even tell my kids, we're going through the day. You're going to wake up, you're going to brush your teeth, you're going to go to school, you're going to study hard. What if you wake up with, the right intention, and you reorient yourself towards what the bigger purpose is, right? Everything you're doing, inshallah, will be rewarded in that vein. You're doing it anyway. And so it's that kind of purpose that I think has become lost on us. I know, people say, professor this, analyst on TV, and I'm like, yeah, but none of that matters if it's done for the sake of this worldly purpose of fame, right? And I don't think any of us or any of the people that you see who put themselves out there are doing it for the purpose of putting themselves out there. It's more of, oh Allah, accept this from me in your vein. Will you be radi anni at the end with what I'm doing? And sometimes we lose sight of that being the purpose, right? Did I want to be a professor from day one? Possibly in some form, but I really think that, of course, from the model of my parents, it was making sure that whatever you're doing is not just for the betterment of society, but also to get you into Jannah. And sometimes I feel like we've moved away from that as the big purpose, or even how we measure success. And I've met people who from all over the world, and some who've gone on to higher levels of government, and but I've done it at a lot of personal expense. And I remember asking someone, when things get hard, what do you do? And he says, I have to renew my intention. Mm-hmm. Because when everything is difficult, or we're going through what we're going through today, if we're not consistently renewing our intention, then all of what we're doing is for what, right? Getting people to vote, being activists in the street, doing the op-eds we write, the segments on TV, if it's not really for a bigger purpose, and that being the bigger purpose, not even the dissemination of correct information about Islam and Muslims in America. No, that's not the objective, right? Inshallah, that's a tactic to the greater objective, which is Allah's pleasure, that we've actually forgotten that that's the purpose. And so again, it's more of a reminder to myself before anyone else of consistently reorienting myself towards that.
Absolutely. And Sister Dalia Mogahed, do you have anything to add about this purpose and the clarity of moving towards it?
I have always, I think the purpose for everything I was doing was always evolving. So what I mean by that is I always wanted to make a difference that that would help people understand Islam and Muslims better. I really feel like that's been a purpose of mine really since even high school, since I read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was 15. I feel like that's when my purpose sort of was born, and then reading the Quran after that, it kind of deepened. But what changed from time to time, what changed over my career was the means, was the vehicle that Allah was giving me to manifest my purpose. And so I think it's very important that young people set their heart and their mind on a purpose, but not attach themselves to one specific vehicle. So sometimes it'll be in the activist role, sometimes it'll be through an organization, sometimes it'll be through a teacher, sometimes it'll be by raising kids for 7 years, and that's it, right? And people get very frustrated when their vehicle doesn't look like they want it to or expect it to. But as long as you're on the right path, because you have the right intention, you've set the right purpose, Allah will give you the vehicle that He deems fit for you at that time. And don't become frustrated with it. Don't become impatient with it. I mean, especially young women, And I remember this a lot of times. They'll say, I just feel like I'm wasting time because I have small kids or whatever. And I'm like, this is a time you'll never get back. This is so precious. And the whole world can wait and will wait. And you're not wasting time. This is enjoy, surrender to this, this phase of your life, and don't be in such a hurry to get into a vehicle that looks like you think it should. The vehicle right now is raising these, toddlers, and be content with that vehicle when it exists, because it's not going to be there forever, and then your vehicle will change. And the other thing that I think is really important is I've seen people become very, very attached to one specific job or one specific organization. And then when that job is taken away for whatever reason, or the organization, no longer exists, or they're no longer on the board of it, they feel like they've lost their purpose, where we confuse the means for the mission. We have to be really clear. There's a difference between the mission, which is timeless and won't change until it's from the cradle to the grave. You will have this mission, but the means that Allah gives you will change, and let that change happen without resistance. You don't become attached to your vehicle. It's a ridiculous thing to do. If your vehicle breaks down, Allah will give you a different vehicle. Don't sit and insist you're going to sit on this broken vehicle and it's not going anywhere. It's not what you're meant to ride anymore. So let those things be things that you don't hold on to, but just hold on to your purpose and your mission.
So the title of this entire session is The Road to Reconnect. And I want to actually, in light of the connection, I want to talk about the disconnection and where we as an ummah are finding this disconnection. Dr. Dalia Fahmy, could you go first?
Sure. So we literally today are at a critical juncture, and it feels like it's more immediate than ever has been in different ways. And let's say, if we look at the Muslim community in the past, since 2015 until today, so the last 5 years, we've been talking about the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment, Islamophobia being not just the irrational fear of Islam and Muslims, but having a real political objective, which is the marginalization of Muslims from civic and political life. So it's not just the kind of hysteria around Islam and Muslims, but for us to internalize it and to actually see ourselves as maybe civic and political life is not for us. And if we're looking at, for example, that level of disconnection, we trace its roots back, earlier 2008, even before that. But if we just look at this past 5-year time period, some of my research looks at the rise of Islamophobic sentiment coming out of our political establishment that rises right up until election and then dies down a little, but the social cultural effects maintain, right? And it seemed for a while, even up until almost the beginning of this week, that that's the moment we're in. But what we did see this past summer and this year is that we can no longer treat the disconnection or the on-purpose disconnection of Muslim Americans, or the attempt to disconnect us and us internalizing it, as separate from all of the other struggles the country is going through. Mm-hmm. Not just the anti-Black racism, the rise of anti-Semitism, the vitriol that comes out of some of our political establishment against all minority groups. That we are beginning to realize that all of our oppressions are connected, and seeing ourselves as separate, which unfortunately is what a lot of minority communities do, actually does that a disservice, because they're so compounded. I can't understand Islamophobia without understanding anti-Black racism. Mm-hmm. And I think what this year has shown us, and really the country as a whole, is that we need to reorient our thinking about one another. And what COVID made very apparent, I live in the state of New Jersey. In New Jersey, when we hit 10,000 deaths, so on the East Coast, we went through it first after California. Of the first 10,000, 9,000 were amongst the elderly living in assisted living communities or in nursing homes. And it became very apparent that we also have throwaway populations. And while all of us were in quarantine, we also had all of the first, the first line. Those are delivering us all of our stuff that gives us the luxury to be in quarantine. And why is it that this elderly woman, older than my mother, is delivering my groceries to me because I have the luxury of being in quarantine? It made apparent a level of social injustice that we can no longer ignore. And it's that we no longer have the luxury of being disconnected. Because if we don't actually recognize all of the levels of systemic oppression, not just against Islamic Muslims, but against all communities and against the economically not privileged, then we are actually doing a disservice and the country a deeper disservice by insisting on being disconnected. And I hate to sound even more judgmental, but being disconnected is also a privilege. Because you can actually separate yourself from those who feel it so viscerally, which are Black and brown people in America today. And for me to say, this is not for me, I'm going to step out of the political process, I'm not even going to vote, that comes from a level of privilege and class that says the immediacy of what's happening in the country doesn't really affect me.
So with that said, the question becomes how do we remedy that disconnection? You know, and it almost ties into another question, which was how do we start mobilizing our communities to reconnect? Sister Dalia Mogahed, would you mind taking this one?
I think, building on what Dalia said, we have to first educate our communities on how connected we are, because one of the goals of bigotry in general, whether it's Islamophobia or anti-Black racism or anything else, is to make communities feel like they have no allies, to make them feel isolated, and that their issues are only their issues. And so when you feel weak, when you feel overwhelmed and outnumbered, you're much more likely to do nothing. You're much more likely to give up. And so first, educating our communities about the shared struggle that we have in front of us. Who are the folks that we can work with on what topics? How to build coalitions. Secondly, I think a very important part of this, idea of mobilizing our communities, is to make sure that we help folks understand that they can make a difference. So we've done research at ISP where we've looked at, a very simple number, which is the percentage of Muslims that are registered to vote, who are eligible to vote. And what we've seen is that number has climbed steadily since 2016, from 60% in 2016 to now nearly 80%, 78% in 2020 say they're registered to vote if they are eligible, which is phenomenal that growth has happened. But there's also a solid 15 to 20% of eligible Muslim voters who are both not registered and tell us they have no intention to vote. It's not that they haven't gotten around to it or whatever, it's they actually are not even intending to vote. And that group is what we now have to reach into, because before it was a lot of people who just hadn't gotten around to even, doing the most basic part of reconnecting or mobilizing, which is registering to vote. Now, most of those people have actually gone ahead and registered. Now we're dealing with this significant minority of people who, when we ask them, why aren't you going to vote? Why don't you want to vote? They tell us because they don't like the options, or they don't think their vote matters. So it's this sense of apathy. And 15 to 20%, that's almost 1 in 5 of us, is way too high. With a community that's only 1% of the population from the beginning, this is too many people not participating and believing, self-disenfranchising themselves, self-disempowering. This is the group we really have to reach into and convince and engage and understand better how to bring them along.
It makes me wonder what exactly they see their role in the United States is, and when it comes down to it, in both of your opinions, what is doing your part? What is the bare minimum? You mentioned voting. I mean, how do we dig into this community? Where do we start? I guess, Sister Dalia Mogahed, if you want to take that, just to continue on.
So what is our bare minimum? You know, I would say voting is a bare minimum. I think registering to vote and voting in your local elections as well as your federal elections actually is the bare minimum that you can do. But beyond that, I want to, you know, introduce a different idea, which is just how are we defining success? I think we need a bit of a paradigm shift. You know, we just came out with the 2020 ISPU poll of American Muslims. And one of the, you know, the most surprising parts of it is the percentage of Muslims who approve of President Trump's job performance and who actually want him to win the next election. It's not everybody, it's not even the majority at all, but it's still a growing number. So 30% in March and April said that they approve of his job performance, and 14% of Muslims want Trump to win the next election. Now the 14% is not that surprising because 15% of Muslims are Republicans, and they tend to just vote Republican no matter what. But when you really dig into the data, I wonder what are people's definition of success in this country? How are we defining, you know, arriving, being a, I'll tell you what I mean by this. A lot of times, and I think, you know, maybe this was even a question that both Dalia and I got at the same panel, but this is a popular question I get asked, whether on panels or just by private individuals. They say, what can we learn from the Italians or the Poles or the Irish? You know, they were immigrants, they came, and then, you know, they were discriminated against for some time, and then they were sort of like accepted. So what can we learn from them? And it kind of reveals how we're thinking of success. So what does that mean? Why would we want to learn anything from them? Nothing against any of these groups, okay? But what are we really saying? We're saying that they are now white, right? How did they all get accepted? What exactly happened? What was the switch that kind of came? They've been absorbed into whiteness. And so now they're white and they are not discriminated against anymore. Okay, that is not the right measure of success. What you've done is you've just ascended an oppressive hierarchy, right? An oppressive racial hierarchy. Ascending that hierarchy is not success. B, it's not actually going to happen because most Muslims are not white passing. So they are never going to just join, you know, this group that is the privileged group in America. What should our definition of success be? If that is not it, you know, if you think about the Prophet ﷺ and you study his seerah, what you learn, if anyone who studied seerah knows that you start all the way from like before Mecca was even a thing, right? And where are the Arab tribes from, etc. What you learn when you study the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ is he was of the most noble blood. He was a person of nobility in terms of his lineage. And yet he came with a message that said we're all equal. So he traded in his tribal privilege, which is like a racial privilege in our world, for equality of people, for a message that says the only thing that differentiates one person or another is their merit, is piety, is taqwa. So he traded in privilege for principle. And it would be a very sad state of affairs if us as Muslims, who we claim he is our example, we would trade our principles for the promise of privilege, which is actually not going to happen. So when we look at what the definition of our success is in our country, it is to call for and to work for a different kind of society that is not where the racial hierarchy that is oppressive is not reality, is not how things are organized, where society is organized in a different way. That's our success. It's not ascending an oppressive hierarchy, but rather challenging it and rebuilding a different society.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Dalia Fahmy, do you have anything to add to this idea of doing your part and what activism looks like here in America?
So one of the biggest things that we hear is, okay, I can't go out into the streets, right? And people think that that's what it means to be civically engaged. So if we look at our Islamic heritage, we know, we constantly hear about the rights of the neighbor. But what really are the rights of the neighbor? So if I know, for example, my neighbor has an autistic child, and with the pandemic and everyone being home in quarantine, things are getting difficult, and maybe they've lost their job. What rights does my neighbor have from me? And we usually don't take that extension of the definition of neighbor to literally my next door neighbor, right? We limit it to ourselves sometimes, unfortunately. And even moving beyond that, on our street, are you part of the neighborhood recycling program, neighborhood watch? Are you fighting to make sure that every kid has equal access to the blue ribbon district that we're in? Or is there some stratification? The only way to know is if you're part of the PTA, right? And so it's that reorienting of what does it mean to be a Muslim. One of the things that I think is most beautiful about our faith is that while we have a religious duty as Muslims, our religious duty extends to our civic obligation as Americans. So we are actually obliged to be civically engaged. And how does that happen? One of my friends, he's a professor at University of Seattle, Washington, Karam Dana. He did a study where he looked, and this is one of the first studies done on Muslims in America, where he looked at the relationship between going to the masjid and becoming civically engaged. And what they find is that the more you go to the masjid, right, the more you know what's happening in your neighborhood, the more you actually become civically engaged. And so there's a positive correlation between that. But why is it that we deny our next door neighbors that definition of neighbor? You can't then overlook all of the small and big injustices and say, I'm not going to vote. Again, it comes from a place of privilege to say, I can be civically disengaged, or it doesn't matter to me. It might not hurt you as immediately as it actually hurts your next door neighbor. So it almost becomes incumbent upon us to fight for their right to actually live the same way we do. And it's that definition of being a civic-minded Muslim that comes from our religious duty, not our civic obligation, but our religious duty to be civically engaged. And if you think about why all of the prophets were sent to mankind, it was to uphold justice. And what does upholding justice mean? Does it mean simply going out into the street, or does it mean to ensure that in my neighborhood, injustices don't occur? And it's a small injustice, a pothole that won't be repaired, a street that's unsafe for kids to cross. And in order for that to happen, I have to be engaged. And so sometimes I think, you guys are in Michigan, and I know Professor Jackson, before he went to California, was in Michigan. And he has this wonderful sentence where he says, we need to rearrange the furniture in our head, right? We need to rearrange the furniture in our head that gets us to think about our role in America in ways that actually affect the everyday lived experience of my next door neighbor. And if we're really going to, as Dalia said, embody the definition of the Prophet being as-salam, a mercy to mankind, imagine if, when that becomes our role on our street, on our in our neighborhoods, and so that when non-Muslims see Muslims moving into the neighborhood, they say, oh wow, those are the people that are going to come and make sure that our rights are being served. Like, imagine if that's the narrative, rather than there go the property values. Imagine if the narrative is, look, they're here and nothing can happen without them defending our right just to live an equal life. Here in New Jersey, while the state always goes blue, we have a very privileged, economically privileged part of the community. And we also live in the state with the highest taxes. So in the last election, there's a pretty active mosque that went red. Like, most of the masjid voted Republican. When you ask them why, and this is, again, very economically privileged community, because they wanted tax cuts. And so they were voting their own economic interest, not necessarily the economic interest of their next door neighbors, right? Or of the community. And so it's that questioning of, what does it mean to belong, right? What does it mean to uphold justice? What does it mean to be a mercy to mankind? That we have to, just as Sister Dalia said, reorient our definition of success. And it's that kind of thinking. Of course, I want my taxes to be lower, but if that is actually giving better education to my neighborhood, then how can I deny that aspect, right? And I know I'm simplifying things, but it's that way of thinking. It's not about me and myself, me belonging as a Muslim, as being civically engaged, because it's my religious obligation. It can't be devoid of my neighbor's lived experience.
Right. This idea of belonging, I think what I've seen speaking to Muslims my age, in their 20s, post-college years, especially with quarantine, the experience of being unmosqued is so huge. It's so huge to the visibly Muslim, to the practicing Muslim, but the environment, the masjid itself, is not somewhere that really at this point we're even able to find solace in. So I want to talk about what a community looks like and how we can properly engage with it if we're not connected to different organizations, for example, if our starting point is the masjid. Sister Dalia Mogahed, could you take this question?
Well, first, thank you, Ahmed, for bringing this question up. Mosques really matter. And I totally agree with you that there is definitely a trend of being unmosqued, and among religiously oriented, people who take their faith seriously, and they don't see the mosque as a part of that. And I think it comes from two different things. One is that many mosques are indeed doing a bad job of engaging young people, of being a place where people can find what they're looking for in terms of their spiritual needs. And then there's also a growing hyper-individualization that I see, where folks are doing everything by themselves. We've lost the appreciation and the understanding of the need for sohbah, for community, for other humans, even usually in a physical space. There's a resonance that happens when we're all standing foot to foot, shoulder to shoulder. It's not the same as praying at home by yourself. And we all, I think, felt it when we had to do tarawih at home, right? We all miss that. There is a spark. There is a sense of, we get this sense that maybe that this idea we're all sharing is plausible. when other people are sharing it with you. You don't feel like you're the only one. You don't feel as alienated when there are others with you. So I want to make a case for why we can't give up on mosques. Mosques do matter. And like Dalia said, every study I'm aware of, ours as well as Karam's and others, has said that attending a mosque frequently is correlated to civic engagement, being more likely to vote. It also is correlated to more positive mental health outcomes. So attending a mosque more frequently than even once a week, so you're actually going super frequently, more than once a week, so you're going maybe for some daily prayers, is associated with lower anger, lower depression, more hope. So a mosque is not something that is not just simply four walls that we walk in and pray and leave. There are so many benefits of mosques. So I want to make the case for why we can't give up on mosques and we have to work for better mosques. And that's why we at ISPU did an entire study on how to make mosques more inclusive, more engaging for young people, women, and converts, the three groups that we looked at. And it's a project called Reimagining Muslim Spaces. What I thought was really interesting about some of those findings is we asked, we had focus groups around the country of these three groups, and we asked all of them to describe their most positive mosque experience. So we kind of flipped the way we approached it. It wasn't tell me your nightmare story. We've already heard those. We wanted to hear, what was your most positive mosque experience? And what we heard over and over was about feeling welcomed, having other humans acknowledge your existence, look at you in the eye, care that you're alive, and say, we're glad you're here. We welcome you. You belong here. That sense of belonging, that sense of welcome took precedence over even the language of the khutbah. This is what blew me away. A woman told us she went to a mosque where the khutbah in America was in Turkish. She didn't understand anything, but she went there because she felt welcomed by the sisters that were there. So it's that important. We think it's all in let's bring the most amazing speaker or whatever. The khatib has to be amazing. Yeah, that helps. And I'm not discounting that, but it's about the community. It's about the community seeing itself as a community, as a family, as a place where people are told, if you're here, then you belong. If you're here, then you're one of us.
Right. I have a question about sort of balancing the faith and the identity, because what I've seen a lot with activism is it's the Muslim identity that we are holding on to, but there's sometimes the spiritual element that hasn't been incorporated into the efforts, and it's especially when you take the mosque out of the picture, that's even more so. But Dr. Dalia, if you could talk a bit about really balancing the Muslim identity and the Muslim faith together and how we can effectively do this.
Yeah, this is actually a big problem, and I think it's actually bigger than we realize. There was I'll say something, and I'll say a story. There was a time where there was a lawsuit against a company that wasn't allowing Muslims to pray, or it didn't, and so there's a lawsuit. And a group of Muslim lawyers were fighting, and they won. And subhanAllah, when the verdict was announced, it was then time to pray. And when it was time to pray, nobody got up and prayed. And so it became very clear that Muslims and Muslim lawyers will fight for the right to pray, but they might not be joining the line of salah. And so what's happening here, right? Is this just what we do, like the identity politics and fighting for the right? Of course, it's very important. But what does it mean then to not join the line of salah? And I'm a professor of politics. I'm not a spiritual teacher. Dalia is much more adept at this than I am. But I'll say this one short story, and hopefully she can pick up in terms of the quality. Sister Aisha Adawiya is a civil rights leader in New York City. She was with Malcolm X. She was on the bridge. She's been fighting for rights, since long before many of us were born. And she continues to do all-time high, and everyone was phone banking and working, and nobody's sleeping. And in New York, she was in the room with the cream of the crop of the activists, right? And they're strategizing, there's boards everywhere, and she's looking at this room with tears in her eyes. And and we're thinking, like, she's probably saying, wow, look at this generation, right? And she turns to someone next to her and she says, I don't know how to tell them none of this matters if their salah is not on time.
Wow.
She's like, and I can't stress to you enough, this is the top echelon of the activists in America. And they're working hard, and the strategy's on the board, and they haven't slept. And she says, and this is a civil rights activist. She runs the Schomburg Center for Malcolm X, right? She said, I don't know how to tell them none of this matters if their salah is not on time. And that's the big disconnect that happens to all of us, unfortunately, right? Is I'm doing God's work, but I'm not doing the things that he has obligated us to actually do. And when you think about the beauty of our faith, and again, I say this as a super lay person, everything is permissible in action except what's impermissible, right? So you can do everything except what Allah says don't do, right? You can eat whatever you want except what he says don't eat. But when it comes to prayer, for example, you can only do what he says you have to do, right? So you can't pray one, you can't pray 500. You have to pray 5 times a day. And with that, that's what we're willing to negotiate in sometimes our activist roles. And so just as you're, positing the question, this disconnect denies all of the work, the barakah that would come if we actually did what we're obligated to do. But in terms of the spiritual element, this is Dalia Mogahed.
Please, Sister Dalia Mogahed, if you could go give us a little insight.
Amal, I love Quranic tafsir. I love tafsir of Quran, and I love to look for answers in the Quran. And this is not even a tafsir by any means. This is more of like a reflection. But I always think about Surah Ya Ayyuhal Muddathir as almost like a blueprint for the activist. Because what this surah was when Allah commanded the Prophet ﷺ to make the da'wah public, to actually go out and call people to Islam, to become a public person. And he started this surah by addressing a person who was covered up and wrapped up in a blanket, a person who was very reluctant, very cautious, very aware of the enormity of this effort, of this trust of being a public figure or serving in this way. So he says, Ya ayyuhal muddathir qum fa'andir wa rabbaka fakabbir. So these 3 things, O you who is wrapped up. So the starting point is caution, a recognition of the enormity of the responsibility. Then qum fa'andir, stand and warn. A warner is not a compeller, and at the same time, a warner is not one who is responsible really for how those around him behave in the end. And the outcomes are not in his hands. His success criteria is, did you deliver the message? We have to be, as I put it before, we have to be mailmen or women and not missionaries. Our success is, did we deliver the message? And then فَرَبِّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, and then glorify your Lord. So if in our zeal to deliver the message, we have forgotten the entire reason we were even created, then we've actually lost the plot. We've become something very different and very hollow. All the strategy in the world and all the work in the world, and this is something that I had to discover, that Islam does not need you. The work does not need you. You need the work. Mm-hmm. The work is something you need because it is how you serve your Lord. If you are doing it in such a way that it is not adding to your scale, it's like a hollow, wasted effort, because nothing you do actually makes any difference. And this sounds, I know it sounds, what I'm saying probably sounds insane. What I don't mean that we shouldn't work. Actually, I mean the opposite. I think we should do everything we can because we are the ibad of Allah. We are the servants of Allah, and a servant obeys. And what are we told to do? We are told to do our best. We are told to work. We are told to strategize. We are told to study and do our homework and do the best we can. We have to do things with ihsan because that is what we are called to. But to delude ourselves into thinking that the outcome is because of our effort is what I'm warning against. The outcome is in the hands of Allah. And the only thing we are responsible for is this obedience. It's actually very liberating. Don't connect yourself. Don't attach yourself to an outcome because you actually have no power over it. You only have power over your actions and your intentions. And that's a very liberating idea. You only have to worry about what you actually control, which is your own self, your own actions. But if your intention isn't there, if the animating force behind your work isn't the pleasure of Allah, isn't the service of Allah, then it is hollow. And it is, when we're told in the Quran that it's like you're fasting, but you're not getting any credit for it, and all you're experiencing is hunger and thirst. It's exactly the same. All you're experiencing is sleepless nights and stress without it really having any value if it's not animated by this fervent love for Allah and his messenger. So when that is missing, I think we just have to go back to square one and start over. And I tell the activists something I had to learn, the hard way a million times, and I still forget it. The best way to avoid burnout is to not believe that the outcome is in your hands and to hold yourself accountable for it. Let the outcome be the outcome. Don't measure your success by the outcome, which is the opposite of what you learn in corporate America and in school and in every other place. Success is not measured by what the outcome was. Success is measured by your intentions and the ihsan of your actions. And it's things you have complete control over. Whatever happens on the other side is in Allah's hands. Don't attach yourself to that. Don't give yourself credit when it goes well, and don't blame yourself when it goes badly, as long as those other two things were in place.
Jazakallah khair. I think that's so insightful. And it leads to the final question. Unfortunately, honestly, I feel like we could, and I wish we could go a couple more hours with this, but I wanna end with an open-ended question, and it's gonna be for both of you as our final question. And what is square one for the Muslims right now in America who are trying to connect their identities and their faith right now? How do they get their feet back onto this road? How can they reconnect? And this is just advice for everybody. So Dr. Dalia Fahmy, if you could take this first.
I always have a tough time with spiritual things, but I'll tell you, I've been privileged to meet people from all over the world, sheikhs from all over the world, alemas from all over the world. And I've gotten in the habit of asking people as I leave them, what advice can you give me? And I will tell you 90% of the time it's been, make sure you have a wird of afkar. Make sure you have some afkar that you say every morning and every night. Things that reorient your heart back to Allah. again, like I said at the outset, your day is your day. You're going to move through it anyway. Imagine if it begins with a wird of adhkar. And I was even told by someone, and make sure you hold on to it with all of your might more than you do anything else. And you wonder why that is. Why is it to be constantly or in the remembrance of Allah is important? But I realistically speaking, we're all so busy, right? But what if there is a moment where for 22 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening, you're actually pausing to reorient yourself, to renew your intention, and to remember what you're doing. And I know this is so much easier said than done, but there's an Afkar app, right? And there are many, but there's one that actually breaks it down by, morning, evening, before you read Quran, before Salah. It's really simple. And it's called Al-Afkar. That's what it is. And it's, again, 22 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the evening. And you find yourself over time, not just memorizing it, but almost needing that pause. Like I commute, so I do it on the train, that pause to shut out the noise and remember why we're here. And when I tell you, political prisoners, everyone has said, if you don't have a wird of adhkar, you're not, then what are you doing, right? And we all at some point, especially in quarantine, and I'll openly admit, felt a little lost, right? Like everything was upside down and things didn't make sense. And I think for the first time, most of us couldn't predict the future, right? And there was so much uncertainty. And it really jarred us. It jarred me, I'll be honest. But we're still the privileged ones, right? What about the people in Syria and Sudan and Kashmir and on our southern border who live with uncertainty every single day? What do they hold on to? And again, we're so privileged that we're negotiating, should I vote or not? Like that's a question. What am I doing, right? Where's my identity? Where's my faith? And it almost seems like today, more than ever, we actually need to bring them together and remember that it's our faith that's going to help us make sense of everything else. And if it's sometimes a struggle just to get through the day to make sense of it, imagine if at least at some point, morning and night, we stop and say, I'm shutting out the crazy and I'm just going to reorient myself. And inshallah, that'll bring the barakah and the clarity and everything else. And if it doesn't, we keep trying. But, it's that we're at this critical juncture. And I truly believe, we talk about post-communist world, post-9/11 world. In this COVID world, everything's being redefined in different ways. And it's at this moment where I think Muslim Americans actually have the most to contribute, because our faith compels us to not leave people behind. And when things get difficult, even for us, me as a believer, it's that reorientation and closing out the noise to try to make sense of the day and accept that I can't predict the rest of the semester, let alone the rest of the year, that inshallah will make sure that Allah is with us on this journey.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. And for anyone who might have missed it, the app is called Al-Adhkar. Sister Dalia Mogahed, do you have any parting words?
Well, First, I just want to completely endorse what Dalia just said. I absolutely agree about the importance of adhkar. The only thing I will add is to reconnect our identity to our faith, to our actual spirituality. I think, in addition to this wird of adhkar, is reestablishing a connection with the Quran. The Quran is a letter from the Creator, his final appeal to humanity. It's like, how are we not reading it? How are we ignoring it? It's such a precious, important book, and it really has secrets and jewels and so many of the answers we're looking for. So I encourage every single person out there to make a commitment to read some Quran every single day and reestablish your connection and your relationship with the Quran beyond Ramadan. Just make it a part of your life. integrate it into your daily life, and I promise you, your life will transform.
Do you recommend starting with page 1?
I don't. I recommend starting with Surah 114. I think you go from the back to the front, make it, the surahs you're familiar with first, and then just go consistently until you get to page 1. Read the tafsir if you can. I recommend, since we're recommending apps and websites, my favorite Quran website is called QuranHive.com. I mean, I'm completely in love with this website. You can hover over every single word. It'll give you the Arabic root. It'll give you the definition. It'll give you all the places in the Quran it was used. That's that one word. And then it gives you like 7 different tafsir of that ayah. So it is an amazing resource. So use that, and or a number of other websites that are out there. But make the Quran a part of your life.
I think that is the advice I needed to hear. I don't know about everyone viewing, but Dr. Dalia Fahmy, Sister Dalia Mogahed, honestly, thank you so much for the time that you gave us and the insight and the clarity. I definitely think that for me, just being able to walk out of here, I have some direction, and we get to start with 114 and download Al-Adhkar, inshallah. I think that's a good place. Thank you so much, everybody, and Iman, thank you and the organization for having us. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallahu khairan for all 3 of you, Sister Amal, Sister Dalia, and Sister Dalia, for joining us. We are so happy to have you and our final session on the road to Reconnect. Inshallah, we are also excited to host everyone viewing and all your friends and family members at our 2020 Reconnect conference happening next week, inshallah. So Jazakallahu khairan for joining us tonight, and we hope you have benefited, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.